service, as well as, of course, as the ability to handle the pressures and problems that you know are in our immediate future. We ask now then that God the Holy Spirit would provide for each of us self discipline, genuine humility, concentration, anything else we could possibly need to be teachable and prepared for a proper study. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we are in a study of Job. We did a review of Hebrew poetry, and then last week we actually got started. Oops, sorry about that microphone. We actually got started in Job. That's the end of November already. Can you believe that? Last day of November, first of December tomorrow. Anyway, so we're at actually point 22. So point 22 is the book of Job. We started subpoint A, the author and the date. We saw that the author is anonymous, most likely Job himself. He's a Gentile prior to the patriarchs, or at least during the time period of the patriarchs, but not any later than that. Okay, some think it might be Moses. All right. And then next, we saw the recipients in subpoint B. Is that where we're ready to pick it up? Is it B or C? Yeah, so subpoint 3. Okay, so subpoint A, under subpoint A. Okay, subpoint A had author and date. First subpoint, little ones. One with single parents on it, not little one. One with single parents on it said the author of Job is anonymous. There is no consistent rabbinical tradition. Job, Elihu, Moses, Solomon, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Ezra have all been nominated. Job probably wrote the book that bears his name. Apart from the fact that the book bears his name, there's no reliable information about Job himself. He was a historical person. Ezekiel 14:14, Ezekiel 14:20, James 5:11. He was acquainted with all the facts and recorded them. Subpoint 2 said Job is not an Israelite, and the book makes no mention of the covenants between Israel and God. There's no reference to any other known events from the Old Testament history, implying that the book was written very early, most likely in the period before the patriarchs, but no later than the time of Moses. There's nothing to indicate the date of the book itself. Job's great wealth is measured in terms of the number of cattle in his possession and servants in his employ. Job 1:3 compared with 42:12, rather than silver or gold. And then I give you a whole bunch of other reasons as to why that time period makes sense. Subpoint 3 says, however, there are others who state that because the land of Uz, and that's or Uz, but it's Uz, Job 1:1, is adjacent to Midian, where Moses lived for 40 years, Moses could have obtained the record left by Job. That would explain how the Israelites possessed this non-Israelite story and gave it canonical status. However, given the other data, the most likely account is that the book was written before the Pentateuch and by Job around 2000 to 1800 BC. BC. Now we're ready for subpoint B. That's where I have my little hash marks as subpoint B. So subpoint B. Recipients, colon. Because we cannot pinpoint the date of writing, comma, because we cannot pinpoint the date of writing, comma, we have no way of knowing who the intended recipients were. If Job wrote it, it's kind of a pedantic statement, but I'm going to make it anyway. If Job wrote it, then the recipients were the people who lived during the period of the patriarchs. However, the content of the book addresses a universal problem of all mankind in all ages, are we having problems? Okay. However, the content of the book addresses a universal problem of all mankind in all ages, which is why it is part of the canon. Knowing the identity of the recipients comma, in this case, comma, would add nothing to the importance of the message. See, if it's important for us to know who the recipients were in order to understand the message, then we would know who the recipients were. When we have the Pentateuch, for example, we know that it's the beginnings of the nation of Israel, and it's important for us to know that because then we understand why the book was written and all the information in it. In the New Testament, for example, when we're studying First and Second Peter, it was important for us, and it is important for us to understand who the recipients are because it gives us a lot more of an understanding of why Peter wrote the book, the feelings, the emotions that he had. In First Peter, when he was talking about making sure that you treat the government correctly, and that even though the government is malfunctioning, you have a responsibility to obey the rules of the government until such time that there are no longer any rules in the government. Those kinds of things we had to understand because the churches, the 5 churches in Asia Minor, were about ready to be under, or the threat was there that they were going to be under persecution by Nero. Knowing that fact, knowing who those recipients were, knowing the historical background of that, gave us a much more colorful flavor to the writings of Peter. It gave us an opportunity to understand what he was saying and how that would then turn around and apply to us. And it was fantastic for us because we got those 2 books during a time period, which is still going on, in which our country is being threatened by its leaders. Our constituents are being threatened by its leaders. Our civilization is being threatened by leaders who are leaderless and who swear to uphold the Constitution and don't, right? I mean, look at what happened when we had federal buildings being attacked by mobsters. They end up getting arrested, and we have Democratic leaders who bail them out, right? As opposed to making sure that they got the maximum amount of punishment for going after federal property that you and I as taxpayers pay for. But anyway, that, I'm not going to get into that. I could get sidetracked very easily. I'm not going to get into that. But the idea is that if we needed to know who the recipients were, then it would tell us. In this case, what we actually learn is by not knowing who the recipients are, we can understand that the information in this book, this whole idea of the poetic books, that give you a much more emotional response, if you will, to the doctrinal information. This gives us an understanding that this is a universal problem. By not knowing who the recipients are, we understand that everyone who is trusting in God can get into a situation where they have undeserved suffering. And if they're not careful, they get into feeling sorry for themselves, turning it into true suffering, having mental attitude sins associated with that. What's different is he is a believer, obviously, because chapter 1 tells us that God sees him as a believer, but he's obviously not in the same dispensation we are in. So the mechanics are going to be different than we experience, but the idea is it's still a universal problem. one of the things that we have to be careful of, because this is such, it is an older book, if we believe that it was written either at the time of the patriarchs or even before, it's the oldest book. And the idea is we have to understand that just because it's the oldest book, there were still believers, right, from the time of Adam all the way through. So you have to remember that, okay, he's not a Jew, he's a Gentile, but he's a Gentile believer. There were Gentile believers during that time period, right? Noah and those guys, they were Gentile believers, right? Adam was a Gentile believer. Adam wasn't a Jew, right? Adam was a Gentile, okay? So that's why it's part of the canon, is it's universal. Subpoint C, structure, colon. Like many of the books, this book can be outlined in various fashions. I have chosen one which gives us a good way to understand the book. Without going too deep into literary analysis. Or staying so high as to be of no help. So if you haven't figured it out, one of the things I'm trying to do as we go through this Old Testament survey, if you will, or overview, or whatever you want to call it, it seems sometimes that it's deeper than an overview. But the idea, what I'm trying to do, since we don't have the opportunity to stop and go through every single book, we would never make it through every single book if we had to exegete the whole thing. We were 20, 30 years into Proverbs. And we still only made it through chapter 11 or something like that. Okay, so the idea is we don't have the opportunity to go through, but what I'm trying to do is give you enough material here so that you can go back and refer to this information and look at the outlines, look at some of the information. So as you read it on your own, you have the opportunity to get a little bit more information, get a little bit deeper, right? And then you can come ask me questions or whatever. But the idea is so to help you, quite frankly, to help you be able to read the Bible on your own, right? Giving you enough information so that you can look at it from different perspectives. You can understand where the different players are, what's going on, and to give us, as we go through, the general overview of the individuals and the heroes in the Old Testament, which we hadn't covered for many, many years in the church. And then also to bring in, how does all of this fit into the New Testament and into our dispensation? What does it mean to us? So that's why I always go through kind of the date, the authorship, the structure, some of the characters, or maybe some of the topics that are in the book, right? And then try to end with, what does it mean from the New Testament, or what does it mean from the dispensation of the church, right? So that's kind of the way I'm trying to stick to it. Sometimes I go a little bit deeper than I should, maybe. Other times, I don't think I've fallen on the side of not giving you enough information. Okay, so yeah, when we get done, you might be able to get a degree in theology or something. But anyway, that's where we are. So I try to pick something that gets us down into it, but not so high that it just glosses over it. Okay, so that's the structure I'm going to give you. Subpoint 1. This is the structure. Okay, subpoint 1. The book of Job is a story. Unlike other stories in the Old Testament, I have to be clear. When I say story, it's nonfiction. Okay, it's not a story like Once Upon a Time, right? This is a true story, right? So unlike other stories in the Old Testament, and I've always tried to stay away from the story. I try to use the word account, but in this case, I have to use the word story. Unlike other stories in the Old Testament, this one is not just a narrative, semicolon, or comma, actually. It is a story with a great deal of dialogue. So you've had these other accounts where they're being given to us from the position of a omniscient third party, if you will, where they write these things that happen. This one is one that's written as a dialogue, so it's different. It's like reading a play. Okay, in fact, continuing the sentence here. So this is not sentence, new sentence. It is a story with a great deal of dialogue. Period. It is more like a drama than a narrative. The key to the structure, however, is the type of literature, colon. This is why we got into types of literature. Okay. The key to the structure, however, is the type of literature, colon. Job 1:1 through 2:10 is prose. So remember, when we did the review on Hebrew poetry, the concept of the Hebrew poetry is that it gives you the thought, the idea, remember, more than the rhyme or anything like we have in Western poetry. When they do in poetry, they're focusing on the thought and the idea. Prose is just kind of like a story. So it does start out as a narrative, and you have the narrative of the third heaven where God is there and Satan comes in and he accuses Job, and off we go, right? So that's Job 1:1 through 2:10. So it's prose, semicolon. Job 2:11 through 42:6. Okay, Job chapter 2, verse 11 through 42, verse 6 is poetry. And Job 42:8, well, 42:7 through 17 is once again prose. So the middle of the book is the biggest chunk, and that's why it's poetry. That's why it's here in the writings, and as opposed to being in some other part of the Hebrew Bible. And the idea is that that big chunk is dealing with concepts, dealing with ideas, dealing with primarily the primary question, right? Subpoint 2, two with single parens around it. General structure, colon. The prologue tells of Job's piety and Satan's accusation of God. When I was writing this, for those of you that are old enough, there used to be a TV show called The Streets of San Francisco, and they would have these little scene markers when the show would open up as a television show, right? But still, they would open, and they would have like a prologue, and that was where someone gets killed or something like that, right? And then they would have Act One of the show, right? And then at the end they would have an epilogue, and they would tell you what happened to the person and all of that kind of stuff. It was a unique thing in shows of those days, and that's kind of what I think about here. So I don't know why. I don't know why I stated it just now. Then again, give your fingers a break. But anyway, the prologue tells of Job's piety and Satan's accusation against God. After that is a dialogue between Job and his three friends. That's Job chapters 3 through 31. I should have said the prologue, Job chapter 1 and 2. Okay, and then after that's the dialogue between Job and his three friends, which is Job chapters 3 through 31. Then Elihu, which is Elihu, speaks. That's Job chapters 32 through 37. And God speaks. Job chapters 38 through 42, verse 6. Moses with the prose epilogue. Job 42, verse 7 through 17. Now I'm going to break it up just a little bit more. So the subpoint 3 is going to be outline. The subpoint 3 with single parens around it, outline, colon. And then these next are going to be Roman numerals and stuff like a normal outline. And because we started under Jack, I followed Jack's, normal one, single parents, blah, blah, blah. In school, I think most of us learned something different, which was, Roman numeral 1, capital A, Arabic 1. But anyway, that's how your outline is going to be. So these points don't necessarily line up with points that we have, okay? So Roman numeral 1 is the prologue, colon. A righteous man severely suffering. And overall, that's 1:1 through 2:10. And that further breaks down to subpoint A, or capital A, Job's piety and prosperity. 1:1 through 1:5. So Job's qualifications are given first. A very pious man, and he's been prospered as a result of that. Subpoint B, Satan's proposal, 1:6 through 12. So that's where Satan comes up and says to God, yeah, he's a good guy and he obeys you because you give him a lot of stuff, but let me take it all away from him and you'll see what happens. So that's subpoint C, adversity, Job's adversity, colon, loss of children and wealth, chapter 1, verse 13 through 22. Job loses all of his children and all of his wealth. One after another, messengers are coming in and telling him disaster has struck, and he lost this, he lost that, he lost camels, he lost donkeys, he lost his kids, everything like that. All these weird thoughts go through my head. When I say things like the disaster struck, it reminded me of the old black and white movies we used to watch in health in high school that would teach you how to handle situations. When disaster strikes, do you know what to do with a sucking chest wound? Only the cure for sucking chest wound you can't do nowadays, because what they told us with a sucking chest wound was to take the wrapper off of a pack of cigarettes, the cellophane off a pack of cigarettes, and put it over the hole, because then the lung would be able to suck that into the chest a little bit and close up the hole, and then the person would be able to breathe. But now you could they would die while you're looking for cellophane off of a cigarette pack. Yeah. See, smoking would have saved your life. Anyway, Job's adversity, loss of children and wealth, 1:13 through 22. Subpoint D is Satan's persistence. It's still not enough. Satan has to do more. It's chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. And then finally, Satan says, oh, okay, well, I guess I got to attack him. So subpoint E is Satan's affliction, colon, loss of well-being, and his wife's sympathy, which isn't. So he takes away all his kids, takes away his life, gives him diseases, and then leaves him with a nagging wife. Chapter 2, verses 7 through 10. Okay. That's the prologue, essentially. Now we start the action. Roman numeral 2, dialogues, colon, why do people suffer? This obviously is the biggest chunk. It's chapter 2, verse 11, all the way through chapter 42, verse 6. So why do people suffer? Chapter 2, verse 11 through 42, verse 6. And now we're going to have 3 friends, and we're going to have actually 3 cycles of 3 friends telling Job all why they think that he is suffering. And what we're going to get is a great big dose, and I'm going to give that to you in subpoint D when we get there. But what we're going to get is a great big dose of what's called retributional theology, which basically says that God punishes sinners and He blesses properly functioning people, and therefore, if you're experiencing suffering circumstances, then you must be a sinner, and we know that's not true. Okay, so that's where this is all going to go. Okay, spoiler alert. Subpoint A, with friends, first cycle. Chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 22, which is the last verse in 14, by the way. Capital B, with friends, second cycle. That's chapter 15, verse 1 through 21, 34. Oops, I have a typo. Review and review, and I still end up with typos. Okay, you'll see the typo here. With friends, third cycle. And that should be 22, verse 1 through 31, 40. I believe. Get my Bible here. And I've left my Bible. Oh, I have it. Okay. Oop. Yeah. So 34 was the last verse in 21, and so the next cycle starts with 22:1, not 21:1 as it is here. This is the typo here. It should be 22:1. Okay. I'm not going to fix it right now. Capital D with Elihu, Elihu. Chapter 32:1. Through 37:24. I guess I could have made it easier on you and just left these off. I could have just said 3 through 14, 15 through 21, 22 through 31, 32 through 37. And then E is finally God's response. And so we have with God. And this is the only one where it really makes a difference. Chapter 38, verse 1 through 42, verse 6. Because there's more to 42 than 6 verses. So that's the only one where I really needed to give you the verse number. But with God, 38:1 through 42:6. And then finally, capital or Roman numeral 3, we have the epilogue. Sufferers who trust God become more godlike. Actually, become stronger would be a better way to say that. 42:7 through 17. Fix that. Need to read my notes out loud to myself. Okay. Point D, capital D. Job's dialogue with his three friends. I put friends in quotes. It's one of those with friends like this who needs enemies, right? So Job's dialogues with his three friends, Job 3, chapter 3 through 31. That's everything I gave you up above. I'm just going to give you a little bit more information about that central section. Okay, you have how it's broken down between the three different discussions, but I'm going to give you a little bit more about what's going on there so you get an idea. Okay, so Job's dialogues with his three friends, Job 3 through 31. Subpoint 1. The first part, comma, chapter 3, comma, deals with Job bemoaning his fate even wondering why he was born. Done in the form of a lament. So if you knew nothing about the Bible and someone told you, Job is the the divine sufferer or whatever they want to call him, right? And he's a guy that Satan challenges, and God says he's strong enough he can handle it. Satan challenges him, and he comes out really good at the end, and he's a great guy. They wouldn't realize that a big portion of the book is Job feeling sorry for himself to some extent. Right? And it starts off that way. Chapter 3 starts off with, oh, why poor, right? Just like, what's his name? Bailey in, George Bailey in A Wonderful Life. Since we're getting close to Christmas time here, I'll use a Christmas reference. Okay. Oh, I wish I'd never been born, right? And then, in this case, we don't have a human who turned into an angel come down and help him out, okay? Which doesn't happen, obviously. Continuing the point, in this chapter, he also introduces his three friends. Again, I have that in quotes, who will play prominently throughout the book. Point 2 with single parents. The three cycles of dialogue are poetic in form and let us know that we are not reading transcripts of the conversations that took place between Job and his friends, period. So yesterday when I went to take the dog for a walk, there was a helicopter flying over, a police helicopter flying over, and there were about four, well, not four, I'm exaggerating, there were two police cars that went through the neighborhood while I was walking the dog. Then this morning we were woken up by a helicopter flying over, and come to find out that not only was there a helicopter flying around, there were like 10 police cars because there was a fatal police shooting here on Dobson and 8th at the 7-Eleven out there. It's like, this neighborhood's getting too rough for me. Anyway, the 3 cycles of dialogue are poetic in form and let us know that we are not reading transcripts of the conversations that took place between Job and his friends. People don't speak in poetry. They didn't speak in poetry back then any more than we speak in poetry right now. About the only one that I know that speaks in poetry is probably Jesse Jackson. Right, it's the it's not the aptitude but the attitude that determines your altitude if you have the intestinal fortitude, right? Yeah. But other than him, and maybe a rapper or two, we don't speak in poetry. They didn't speak in poetry either. So the dialogue that we're reading is dialogue that's been put in that form so that we have the idea. And we have to have, when we talked about poetry, we have to understand the references. For example, I'm going to give you, when we get to Elihu, I'm going to give you some information about Elihu and the fact that he's talking about how his brain's about ready to explode. He can't hold it anymore. He's got to talk. And the analogy that he uses is a sack, his stomach, right? Because remember, the sack is, the stomach is an area where emotion comes from, and he's all emotional, and he's a youngster, and he's trying to hold while the old people are talking, and he just can't wait for them to breathe for a second so that he can jump in the middle of it and tell them how smart he is and what he knows. Okay, so anyway, we're not reading transcripts of conversations. Continue the point. The poetry is revealed. The poetry is revealed in the structure of the 3 cycles. Because it is poetry, it is the thought and the idea that matters. And not the actual historical accuracy of the account. It's sort of like when we read Shakespeare's plays and you read Henry V or something like that, right? Henry V was a real king and there was real battles and that kind of stuff. But the poetry that he uses isn't it isn't a historical accurate representation of exactly what happened. It's there to emote. It's there to cause you to feel something. Well, in the Hebrew, the poetry, as we've said, is there to give you the thoughts, to give you the concepts, and not to give you the actual details of the history. Continuing the point, when reading these cycles, comma, note that at the end of the 3rd cycle, and as requested, I put the spellings of the names of the people I'm going to use here. Okay. Note that at the end of the 3rd cycle, Bildad's speech seems truncated, semicolon. Zophar lacks a speech. And Job appears to say things that contradict what he had said elsewhere. The short speeches of the third cycle actually complete a process that was begun in the second cycle, which is a shortening of the speeches. In this way, the dialogue communicates that the three friends have run out of arguments against Job. See, what you get is really good, very, very good literature if you want to look at it from the literature standpoint and not just the theology. But if you look at it from a literature standpoint, what you have is you have the first speeches are a little bit long, kind of long. The second speeches get a little bit shorter, and then the third speeches are just short and truncated or not even there. And part of that is because they keep bringing up these topics and Job keeps refuting them. Not that he's standing up necessarily for God. He's standing up and saying, no, that's not true. I haven't done that. I'm not. Because again, they're using this retributional type of theology where they're saying, hey, you're being punished because you did something wrong. And he's standing up and saying, no, I'm not. I didn't do anything wrong. Right? I've done nothing but worship God like I'm supposed to. I didn't do anything wrong. And so they keep bringing this up. And finally, they realize they're running against a brick wall. And the speech is just, they get tired of bringing up the same thing, and they get shorter and shorter. And it makes perfect sense when we look at it from our human standpoint, right? Soon, you get to that point, like they say, where it's useless to try and teach a pig to sing. So, yeah, he tells it the friends have started running out of arguments against Job. Last sentence. This literary device leads us nicely to the speech of the frustrated Elihu. And Elihu speaks in chapters 32 through 37. So the speech of the frustrated Elihu. And Elihu speaks in chapters 32 through 37. And so Elihu sits there somewhat patiently while these older gentlemen are arguing and they're going back and forth, and he's starting to get agitated. And finally, they have run out of arguments, and then he jumps in. He says, okay, I waited for you guys. Right? But age, and basically what he says is age doesn't give you wisdom. I have wisdom. I'm going to tell you what all this means, right? like these. If you've ever been an employer, there's nothing like getting a young guy that thinks he knows absolutely everything. I mean, I don't mind, someone who has a lot of energy and wants to do stuff, but to not want to learn from other individuals who have been there, you kind of get frustrated. But that's exactly what this guy does. Elihu is just kind of the whippersnapper that jumps in. I remember when I was when I was an engineer, and I was leading a couple engineers in a project. I was the head of the project, and I had this one technician that had been in his Motorola. He had been at Motorola for close to 35 years, right? And I'd been there for maybe at this point, maybe 12, 13. And we had a new guy that had been out of college for maybe 2 years, right? And Dick was this technician's name. And Dick, was this engineer comes to Dick and he says, I want you to build this circuit up. I've given you the schematic, go get all the parts and build it. Because that's what technicians kind of do. They turn your design into something that, hopefully works. But anyway, and in this case, it wasn't going to work, right? And Dick knew it. And so the guy hands him the schematic, and Dick looks at it and he goes, "This isn't going to work." I can tell you why if you want me to, right? And the new engineer is like, "No, I'm telling you, build it like this. I know what I'm doing. Build it like this, right?" And so Dick built it, and the thing didn't work, right? And the new engineer, "Oh, I don't understand. You must have built it wrong." And Dick had finally had enough of it, right? He turns to the kid and he goes, "Look, I have a pair of shoes older than you." Listen to what I'm telling you. This is why it's not working, right? And once the kid shut up long enough, for Dick to tell him why it wasn't going to work, then the thing worked, right? He got him to get it. He made the corrections and the thing worked. But that's what you have with Elihu, who's a whippersnapper. But before we get there, I'm going to talk a little bit about the three speeches. Okay, so subpoint 3 says, in these speeches, we see several points between Job and his friends, colon. We're not going to make it to subpoint little b. We'll get subpoint little a, but boy, I was hoping we get subpoint little b tonight, but I've talked too much. Subpoint little a. These three friends represent what is called, quote, retributional theology, period, end quote. In other words, God blesses the righteous and he curses the wicked. Therefore, if Job is suffering, he must fall in the latter category. And he needs to confess his sins to regain a blessed status. Job agrees that God blesses the righteous and curses the wicked. But he further believes that is not all that defines God's nature. he is suffering, but not because of his sin. Nowhere does he argue that he is sinless. And instead, he agrees with Bildad that no one can be righteous before God. Chapter 9, verse 2. So instead, he agrees with Bildad that no one can be righteous before God. Chapter 9, verse 2. He directly counters the, quote, wisdom, end quote, of his friends in chapter 9, verses 21 through 24. And in this context, he utters the words, comma, quote, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked, period, end quote. See, now what he what he is saying, and he doesn't come right out and say it in the terminology that we in this dispensation understand it. The terminology that we have is we understand suffering circumstances. We understand that can be a blessing. It isn't cursing, right? To his friends, that's black and white. You either, if you're wicked, you get cursing. If you're righteous, you get blessing. And Job's saying, no, there's more than that, right? I'm not wicked. I'm not sinless, but I'm not wicked. And so I'm getting this. There's a reason I'm getting this. And he holds to that. He holds firmly to that he is not malfunctioning, that that something's happened and he's getting this suffering, but it's not because he's sinning. And it's finally at the end, spoiler alert, finally at the end, when God speaks to him, that he finally realizes that it has been for his growth. And then he is reestablished, if you will, and he has he's given back more than what he had when he lost it. Okay, and that's what we're going to get to. But anyway, we're going to have to pick it up with subpoint little b next week, because I ran you even more out of time. So Heavenly Father,